Hello everyone, you're listening to The Right Side of Gaming. Today we're going to be discussing whether Void Mirror should be banned in EDH/Commander, and we're specifically going to be talking about the arguments and counter-arguments in the context of a comparison with Iona, Shield of Emeria. Now if you're not aware, Iona, Shield of Emeria, is a creature card that when it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. Your opponents can't cast spells of the chosen color. So for example, if you are playing against a white-blue deck and you say blue, they can still cast their white cards, but they won't be able to cast their blue cards. If you're playing against, say, a white-blue deck, a blue-black deck, and a blue-green deck, well, none of them can cast their blue cards, but they can all cast other cards. The big issue with Iona is when someone was playing a mono-colored deck. So for example, if you said blue and someone was playing a mono blue commander, well, that shuts down most of their deck. Same if you said green, they're playing mono green, etc. Now, the rules committee banned Iona because it made games unfun. And yes, that was their word for it, because it could prevent other people from playing the game. I found some quotes. They said that it creates a negative experience for many players without the benefit of a positive application. So it was played basically just to keep other people from being able to play their cards, which admittedly that is a legitimate strategy in a lot of Magic, with like stacks and stuff, but this was a little bit more offensive because you could completely shut a single player out. They also said it is an exemplar as the type of card which creates an experience we wish to discourage, namely shutting players out of games. Now they originally thought the cost of the card, because this is a 9 mana creature, and at least 3 of them have to be white, but that's still a pretty high costed card. They thought that would prevent people from playing it, but they found ways to get into play without paying the cost, maybe by ditching into their graveyard and then reanimating it for much cheaper than 9. That's pretty reasonable in a lot of decks. So it's not necessarily just as a commander, but in the 99 when you can dump and recur it, that it was a problem. Now the same article that discussed the banning of Iona went in a little bit on their banning philosophy. So the primary focus of the list, which in this case is the commander ban list, is on cards which are problematic because of their extreme consistency, ubiquity, and or ability to restrict others' opportunities. I think in this case it's that last one that really did Iona in because of its way to just completely shut down certain players. Now, some of the things they look at whenever they're trying to decide to ban a card, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just some of the ones that I pulled out that I think apply here, and even the list they gave wasn't necessarily exhaustive. Some things they look at are if a card can easily or excessively, 1, prevent players from contributing to the game in a meaningful way. Can't really contribute if you can't play most of your cards and you're having to like pass most of your turns. 2, cause other players to feel they must play certain cards. And 3, if it's difficult for other players to interact with, especially if doing so requires dedicated, narrow responses when deck building. So in this case, they're talking about having to put certain cards in your deck, before play even starts, because otherwise you can't play your deck. And a lot of this stuff, I think, when we discuss it, is going to apply to Void Mirror as well. So Void Mirror says whenever a player casts a spell, if no colored mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. So whereas Iona can really shut down monocolored decks really well, Void Mirror has the potential, at least, to shut down colorless decks. Now you're probably thinking, well, there's not a whole lot of colorless commanders. It's true. And a lot of them probably aren't super popular, and that's understandable. One of the things about Commander, especially in recent years, is there's been a shift definitely towards multicolored decks. Multicolored decks get more options. They have a lot more cards to pull from, so you get a lot more combos and things like that. Get access to a lot more of the just straight up powerful cards. In fact, I think when I looked up the top 100 commanders over the past 2 years on EDH Rec, which isn't sponsored by them, I'm just a fan of the website, there were only a handful of monocolored decks and a single colorless commander. But the vast, vast majority were 2 or more colors. But if you're thinking, well, there's not enough colorless commanders to justify Voidmare, it's like, well, then where's the line? How many decks or archetypes does it really have to affect to really count as something that you need to address? Because again, in comparison, there's not a lot of monocolored decks either, at least compared to your multicolored decks. I mean, we have some really popular ones. In fact, one of the really popular ones, I think, was Urza, which I think is an artifact one. And, we talk about mostly colorless decks in here, but in theory, it could really upset some of your colored decks that maybe, are really artifact heavy. They might be able to address some of these issues a little bit easier because they will have probably more access to colored mana than a colorless deck. But it can still, really have an effect on those particular decks. But I don't know if we really have to say that there is a certain threshold it has to meet before it can, be banned, because again, the issue here is whether or not, it can prevent players from contributing to the game. If, it puts them in a position where they feel they have to play certain cards, where they have to put certain cards into their deck before the game even starts. And I think that can definitely happen in a colorless deck. Now, there's probably the issue of frequency. There's probably a lot more decks out there that, say, play white and could splash Iona than are colorless. Okay, that's true. But Voidmare is a colorless card, so it doesn't necessarily have to go in a colorless deck. It can go in your monocolor decks, your 2-color decks, your 3-color, 4, 5-color decks. It can go in anything. And there's probably some decks that don't want to play it because they're going to be casting a lot of cards with colorless mana. And which, to be fair, is probably going to be your colorless decks and your really artifact-heavy decks. But those are the decks that we think Voidmare is going to be an issue for anyway. That's what we're discussing. But everything else could potentially play it because that's prevents all sorts of, not just colorless spells, but a lot of the free spells that people wind up casting. I also like to point out that, the issue with Iona wasn't just something that was as a commander, which, you would definitely see Iona probably multiple times in a game, but one that was in the 99. So there's only one copy of them that they could cast, and you could potentially get rid of it permanently. And the same with Voidmare. There's only going to be one copy of it in the deck, and you could potentially get rid of it permanently. With Iona, I think the strategy was often to, say, dump her in the graveyard and then reanimate her for much cheaper. I mean, you can do the same thing with artifacts. You have cards that can tutor artifacts, ways to recur artifacts, you have ways to copy artifacts. In fact, you could have multiple copies of a Voidmare, probably because, maybe you had some tokens or something. Whereas you wouldn't necessarily be able to have multiple copies of Iona because of the legend rule. Yes, a lot of times, you're probably not going to be searching out for Voidmare, but if you're against one of those colorless or artifact-heavy decks, well, then all of a sudden it becomes a much more appealing target whenever you are tutoring up or recurring or copying something because it can shut out specific players. As far as people's ability to get around these cards, yeah, if you were playing a monocolored deck and someone played Iona, there's colorless kill cards that you can play. Colorless cards tend to be a little bit more expensive, but you can put them in any deck. You add colorless cards that can exile cards or even entire graveyards from play. Maybe it's something that you have to put in your deck, but that's one of our issues here. You feel like you have to put cards in your deck, like you would have had to have put in those colorless kill or exile cards or whatever. The same thing is going to happen in your colorless decks. You feel like you have to put in say, mana rocks that create colored mana, which the rules change. You actually can do that now. You can actually create mana that's not in your color. At one point, that wasn't an option, and this would have completely killed colorless decks, and there wouldn't be any room for discussion. Now it's like, okay, well, my Eldrazi deck or whatever can absolutely make white mana if I need to. But then I still need to make sure that I have those mana rocks in the deck that can make colored mana, or whatever it is that can make colored mana. And because so much of my deck is in fact going to be colorless in a colorless deck, I need to have some sort of critical mass of colored mana generation, which means I have to play not just specific cards, probably a good amount of those specific cards. Because I'm probably going to be playing at least one, if not multiple cards per turn, that would get completely destroyed by Void Mirror. Should also point out that it's typically easier to deal with creatures than it is for artifacts. Every color, even colorless cards, have ways of destroying or dealing with creatures. Maybe you just play a big creature, maybe you have cards that just destroy or exile the card, maybe you can bounce the card, maybe you can do all sorts of things, but it's often easier to deal with creatures than it is artifacts. At the very least, if you're playing a colorless deck, you're probably going to be in the same position against a Void Mirror as you are against an Iona as a monocolored deck. You're probably going to need very specific cards, probably going to have to put them in your deck or be completely screwed if you don't have them. And if you don't have them, if you don't play them, you're not going to be able to do anything or contribute to the game in any meaningful way because you can't play your cards. Now, I don't necessarily think that means we need to ban it outright immediately. But again, I'm not the rules committee. Other people probably have a much larger, wider knowledge of all the cards in Commander than I do. I fully admit that. So if you were looking for a definitive yes or no, we need to ban this card, I can't necessarily give that to you. But I do think it's one of those that, as this card comes out and starts getting into play, it's one of those that I think we really need to be paying attention to. It's one that maybe we need to consider and discuss after it's gotten some play, because I don't think the rules committee bans anything on release. I think they typically wait and see how it does first before making any decisions. But this is definitely one that I think that we need to be paying attention to, because I think it can potentially be really problematic. I know that's probably not the definitive conclusion some people were hoping for, but that's all I've got for today. So if you'd like to leave a like, comment, subscribe, that'd be great, especially if you want to leave your opinions on Void Mirror in the comments, and maybe how you think it should be addressed, or what you think decks should include just as a sort of potential hedge against Void Mirror. Have at it. And if not, that's okay too. I understand. Either way, I hope you have an awesome day, and I will catch you next time.